Hello, friend. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet time with a story that has lingered for more than 2,000 years. A name that feels familiar even if its details are hazy. Atlantis. The word itself carries the sense of something distant and submerged, like a shoreline remembered long after it has slipped beneath the water. Tonight, we'll explore the possibility of whether Atlantis could have really existed. We'll look into the science of what would be required for an entire city to be swallowed up into the ocean. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to subscribe. And if it feels natural, to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. It helps others find their way to this calm corner of the world, one sleepy traveler at a time. Atlantis comes to us from the writings of Plato. He described it in two dialogues, written around the 4th century BCE. In these texts, Atlantis appears as a powerful island civilization, said to have existed thousands of years before his own time. The story is presented as something passed down through generations, preserved through memory and retelling, not offered as a first-hand account. Even in its earliest form, Atlantis arrives already softened by age. What makes Atlantis endure is not certainty, it is familiarity. Many cultures carry stories of lands lost to water, of cities swallowed by the sea, of places that once felt permanent and then quietly disappeared. Long before written records were common, humans lived close to coastlines and rivers. Water meant food, trade, and movement. But it also meant change. Shorelines shift. Tides return again and again. Over long spans of time, land does not stay where it seems to belong. Modern science tells us that sea levels have risen and fallen many times throughout Earth's history. During the last ice age, vast amounts of water were locked in ice sheets. Global sea levels were much lower than they are today. As the climate warmed, ice melted slowly. Coastlines moved inward over thousands of years. For people living near the water, this change would not have felt sudden, but it would have been unmistakable. Familiar ground would have grown damp, then tidal, then unreachable. Stories are one way the human mind holds on to these changes. Research in anthropology shows that oral traditions can preserve memories of real environmental events for very long periods of time, sometimes for thousands of years. Details shift, names change, scale expands, but the core impression remains. Something was here, and then it was gone. Plato's Atlantis was described as orderly and advanced, a place of structure and balance. In ancient Greek writing, such descriptions often served more than one purpose. Philosophers used imagined societies to explore ideas about human behavior, ethics, and decline. Atlantis may have functioned as a mirror rather than a map, a way of talking about impermanence without naming it directly. What matters for us tonight is not whether Atlantis can be pinned to a single location on a modern chart. What matters is that the story rests at the meeting point of memory and geology. Land meets water. Past meets present. Certainty gives way to possibility. These are slow intersections, not dramatic ones. As we move forward, we'll stay with what can be observed and explained gently. The movement of oceans, the patience of stone, the way time smooths sharp edges, both in landscapes and in stories. Atlantis will not demand belief, and it will not insist on disbelief. It will simply sit with us, like a horizon that does not need to be reached. I'm glad you're here. People have always noticed when places disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. A familiar path becoming damp, a shoreline edging closer with each season, a place once dry now reached only at low tide. The human mind is especially sensitive to loss that unfolds slowly. Change that does not announce itself still leaves an imprint. It settles quietly, like sediment, layer by layer. Across many cultures, stories speak of lands taken by water. These stories appear in regions that never contacted one another. They emerge along coasts, rivers, and low plains, places where water and land are in constant conversation. Anthropologists have found that oral traditions can preserve real environmental events for very long periods of time. In some cases, these memories stretch back thousands of years. They do not preserve exact measurements or dates. They preserve impressions. Something shifted. Something was lost. Life had to move. Flood stories appear again and again because flooding leaves a strong mark on memory. Water changes boundaries quickly. It erases landmarks people rely on to orient themselves. And it does so without intention. When a river changes course, it does not announce its decision. When the sea rises, it does not hurry. It simply continues. For people living near water, this creates a specific kind of remembering. Not the sharp memory of a single moment, but the extended awareness of something no longer where it used to be. Cognitive science shows that the human mind tends to compress long timelines into simple narratives. Slow processes are remembered as single events. Gradual change becomes a story with a beginning and an ending. What took centuries may be recalled as a single loss. This does not mean the memory is false. It means it has been shaped to travel. Stories that survive many generations tend to simplify. They lose technical detail. They gain symbolic weight. They become easier to remember and easier to pass on. A place becomes a name. A name becomes a warning. A warning becomes a myth. In this way, lost places do not vanish completely. They change form. They move from geography into story. Archaeology supports this pattern. Many early human settlements were built close to water for practical reasons. Food sources, transportation, fertile land. These same advantages also made those settlements vulnerable. Rising water, erosion, and storms disproportionately affect coastal areas. As sea levels changed after the last ice age, countless early sites were abandoned. Most were never rebuilt. Many now lie underwater. What remains is uneven. Stone structures may endure for a time. Wood, plant fibers, and bone decay quickly in wet environments. The archaeological record near ancient coastlines is incomplete by nature. This absence does not feel neutral to the human mind. Gaps invite explanation. Silence encourages story. When physical evidence fades, memory often fills the space. Not with precision, but with meaning. Lost places tend to grow larger in the telling. Their boundaries expand. Their importance increases. Their disappearance feels total, even if it was partial. This is not exaggeration for its own sake. It is how memory protects what mattered, by making it memorable. In many traditions, water represents both life and erasure. It nourishes crops, it carries boats. It also removes traces of what came before. A place taken by water feels different than a place taken by fire or time. Water leaves no ruins to walk through. It smooths, it covers, it quiets. For the human mind, this creates a particular kind of absence, one that is hard to point to, but easy to feel. This may be why stories of lost lands persist so calmly. They are not always warnings. Sometimes they are acknowledgements that the world changes, that places are not fixed, that memory has its own geography. As we continue, we'll stay with this pattern, not searching for a single lost place, but noticing how many quiet losses shape the stories that remain. These stories do not rush. They do not demand resolution. They simply continue the way water does, long after the shoreline has moved. The story of Atlantis enters history through a specific voice. A philosopher writing in ancient Greece. Someone more interested in ideas than in maps. That voice belongs to Plato. Plato lived in Athens during the 4th century BCE, a time when philosophy, politics, and storytelling were deeply connected. Ideas were explored through dialogue rather than declaration. Questions mattered as much as answers. Atlantis appears in 2 of Plato's works, Timaeus and Critias. Both are written as conversations rather than histories. Speakers question one another. Stories unfold slowly through recollection. In these dialogues, Atlantis is not introduced as a discovery. It is introduced as something already old. A story said to have been passed down through generations, carried from Egypt to Greece, retold across time. Plato places Atlantis thousands of years before his own era, far beyond living memory. This distance is important. It signals that the story does not belong to the present. It belongs to deep time. In Timaeus, Atlantis is mentioned briefly, enough to establish its scale and fate. In Critias, the description expands. The city is orderly, structured, engineered with precision. Canals, harbors, layered rings of land and water. But the account does not reach an ending. The dialogue breaks off mid-description. There is no final scene, no complete resolution. From a historical perspective, this matters. Atlantis does not arrive as a finished narrative. It arrives incomplete, interrupted. Some scholars believe this was intentional. Others think the work was simply never finished. Either way, Atlantis remains suspended. A story without closure. In ancient Greek writing, imagined societies were common. Philosophers often created fictional cities to explore real ideas. Justice, balance, corruption, decline. These cities were not meant to be located. They were meant to be considered. Atlantis fits this tradition. It functions as a contrast. A civilization described as advanced and powerful, and then described as lost. The loss itself is swift in Plato's telling. A single day and night of catastrophe. But even here, the language is restrained. The emphasis is not on drama. It is on consequence. Modern historians generally agree on one point. Plato was not writing geography. He was writing philosophy. That does not mean the story has no connection to the real world. It means the connection is indirect, filtered through purpose. Ancient writers often blended memory, observation, and imagination. They worked in a world without strict boundaries between myth and history, a world where truth could be conveyed through story rather than data. Plato's audience would have understood this. They would not have expected coordinates. They would have listened for meaning. This context changes how Atlantis is read. It shifts the question away from location and toward function. Why tell this story at all? Why preserve it? Why give it such careful detail? One answer lies in how the human mind responds to structure. Order is memorable. Systems linger longer than chaos. By describing Atlantis as organized and balanced, Plato made it stick. The city becomes clear in the imagination, even as its reality remains uncertain. The abrupt ending adds to this effect. An unfinished story invites continuation. It leaves space, not for certainty, but for persistence. As we move forward, we'll keep this framing close. Atlantis as a story shaped by context, by intention, by the way ancient thinkers used narrative to explore impermanence. We are not looking for proof yet. We are learning how the story entered the world, quietly, through dialogue, already aged by the time it was written. From here, the story will begin to loosen from the page, moving outward, toward geography, toward water, toward the slow processes that shape both land and memory. Long before maps settled into their familiar shapes, coastlines were uncertain. Edges shifted quietly, not with spectacle, but with patience. Ancient geography was not fixed in the way modern maps suggest. Land met water along boundaries that slowly wandered. What felt solid in one lifetime could feel temporary in the next. From a geological perspective, coastlines are among the most changeable features on Earth. They respond to sea level, erosion, sediment, and the slow movement of the ground itself. Even without storms or earthquakes, the outline of land is always adjusting. During periods when global sea levels were lower, more land was exposed. Wide coastal plains extended outward from today's shores. Rivers flowed farther. Settlements formed where dry ground met fresh water. As sea levels rose, those plains did not vanish all at once. They narrowed. They flooded seasonally. They became marshland. Eventually, they slipped below the surface entirely. This process unfolded slowly enough that it would not have felt like a single event. Generations might have lived through different stages of the same change. What one group called shoreline, the next might have called shallow water. Geologists know that much of the land now underwater lies on continental shelves. These shelves are gently sloping extensions of continents. They sit beneath shallow seas, and they were once dry land. The existence of these shelves is not speculative. They are mapped, measured, studied. What is uncertain is how much human activity once took place there. Evidence becomes harder to preserve as environments change. Erosion increases, sediment accumulates, organic materials break down. Maps, even modern ones, simplify this complexity. They show clear lines where none truly exist. They suggest stability where movement is the rule. In the ancient world, people would have experienced geography differently, not as abstraction, but as presence. A familiar inlet becoming deeper, a sandbar disappearing, a crossing no longer passable at low tide. These changes did not require explanation. They simply became part of lived experience. Over long spans of time, small geographic shifts accumulate. A coastline that moves a few meters per year becomes unrecognizable after centuries. The memory of where land once extended can outlast the land itself. This helps explain why stories of lost places often cluster around water. Not because water is dramatic, but because it is persistent. It moves boundaries without ceremony. It redraws maps without asking. Ancient societies did not have access to satellite imagery or global surveys. Their understanding of geography came from travel, trade, and memory. When land changed, explanation followed experience. A place that could no longer be reached did not simply disappear. It became distant, then symbolic, then remembered differently. Geological processes offer no intention behind these changes. There is no purpose in erosion, no message in rising water. But the human mind seeks continuity. When physical continuity breaks, narrative continuity often takes its place. In this way, unstable coastlines become more than physical features. They become thresholds between presence and absence, between what is known and what is remembered. The ancient world lived close to these thresholds, without rigid boundaries between land and sea, without the assumption that places would remain as they were. This does not point to a single lost civilization. It points to a repeating condition, land changing slowly enough to be lived through, and remembered clearly enough to be told. As we continue, the focus will remain on this instability, not as a source of danger, but as a natural state. The Earth has always adjusted its edges, quietly, persistently, leaving stories where certainty once stood. As the climate warmed, the world did not change all at once. It softened, it loosened. Ice that had held its shape for thousands of years began to thin at the edges. During the last ice age, enormous ice sheets covered large portions of the planet. So much water was locked into ice that global sea levels were far lower than they are today. Shorelines extended outward. Continents felt larger. Land connected places that are now separated by open water. This was not a brief moment in Earth's history. The Ice Age persisted for tens of thousands of years. Human populations adapted to these conditions. They settled, they moved, they built lives along the edges of rivers, plains, and coasts that felt stable. When the climate began to warm, the ice did not disappear suddenly. It melted gradually, year after year, century after century. As ice melted, water returned to the oceans. Sea levels began to rise, not violently, not dramatically, but persistently. Geological evidence shows that global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters after the Ice Age ended. This rise unfolded over thousands of years, too slow to notice in a single season, but impossible to ignore across generations. For communities living near the coast, the change would have been felt first at the margins. Saltwater creeping farther inland, freshwater wells turning brackish, low ground flooding more often than before. What had once been dry land became unreliable. then seasonal, then unusable. This process did not resemble a catastrophe. There was no single moment of loss. Instead, there was adjustment. Paths shifted. Homes were rebuilt slightly farther back. Fields were abandoned and replanted elsewhere. The human mind is well suited to adapting to slow change. What it struggles with is recognizing when adaptation has become permanent loss. Over time, memory compresses. What unfolded over centuries may later be remembered as a single event. A place that faded gradually can become a place that vanished. Scientific reconstructions of post-Ice Age sea level rise show that some periods of melting occurred faster than others. In certain regions, coastlines may have moved inland by several meters within a human lifetime. Enough to be noticed, enough to be talked about. Even so, the dominant experience was not panic, it was uncertainty. Whether water would stop was never clear. Each generation inherited a coastline slightly different from the one before. The past was not preserved in maps. It lived in recollection. This helps explain why ancient stories often describe water as both patient and decisive. Water does not rush, but it does not reverse. Once land passes below sea level, it rarely returns in the same form. Sediment settles. Currents reshape the surface. The old landscape dissolves into something new. Archaeology confirms that many early human settlements now lie underwater. These sites were not built with the expectation of loss. They were built where land made sense at the time. As seas rose, people moved. Not all at once, not everywhere. Some areas were abandoned completely. Others were transformed into wetlands and deltas. What remained visible on land became only part of the story. The rest slipped quietly beneath the surface. For later generations, the memory of these places persisted without physical confirmation. A shoreline that once existed but could no longer be seen. A route that once crossed dry ground but now required a boat. The Ice Age did not erase human presence. It rearranged it. The rising seas did not destroy civilization. They reshaped where civilization could exist. This distinction matters because it changes how stories of loss are understood. The human mind does not always distinguish between disappearance and transformation. What cannot be returned to often feels gone entirely. As we continue, the focus remains on this slow movement, not as disaster, but as background. The world adjusting itself without urgency, and people adjusting in response, leaving behind traces that were later remembered as something larger, something singular, something named. Beneath the surface of today's oceans, the landscape continues, not as an empty expanse, but as a continuation of land that once felt close and familiar. The seafloor is not flat. It rises and falls. It holds ridges, valleys, and wide, shallow plains. Many of these features sit on what are known as continental shelves. Continental shelves are the submerged edges of continents. They slope gently away from the coast before dropping into deeper water. During periods of lower sea level, these shelves were dry land. They were wide. They were habitable. They supported plants, animals, and human movement. When sea levels rose after the Ice Age, these shelves were gradually flooded. The water did not rush in all at once. It advanced slowly, following the shape of the land. What had once been plains became tidal zones, then shallow seas. Today, much of this former land lies beneath relatively shallow water, often less than 100 meters deep, close enough to be mapped, distant enough to feel unreachable. Oceanographers have charted these submerged landscapes using sonar and satellite data. The outlines are clear. River channels can still be seen etched into the seafloor. Ancient coastlines remain visible as subtle contours. These features confirm something important. The ocean did not erase the land completely. It covered it. But covering is not preserving. Water is active. Currents move sediment constantly. Sand shifts. Silt settles. Structures, if they exist, are slowly buried. Organic materials break down quickly underwater. Wood softens and collapses. Plant fibers dissolve. Bone becomes fragile over time. Stone lasts longer. But even stone is not permanent in the sea. Salt accelerates weathering. Marine organisms attach themselves to surfaces. Tiny movements add up. Over centuries, sharp edges round. Straight lines soften. Human-made features begin to resemble natural formations. This is why submerged landscapes feel silent. Not because nothing is there, but because what remains is difficult to recognize. Underwater archaeology exists, but it is limited. Visibility is often poor. Light fades quickly with depth. Even in clear water, detail disappears as distance increases. Most of the ocean floor has never been explored directly. Much of it has only been mapped in broad strokes. Large shapes are known. Small details remain hidden. This creates an uneven record. What happened on land is easier to study. What happened on submerged land is harder to access. Absence of evidence becomes common. For the human mind, this unevenness can feel unsettling. It suggests missing chapters, places that once mattered but left little trace. Yet from a scientific perspective, this pattern is expected. The ocean is not designed to preserve history. It is designed to move. Sediment carried by rivers spreads across shelves. Storms disturb the surface layers. Tides pull and release again and again. Anything left on the seafloor becomes part of this motion. Not immediately, but inevitably. This helps explain why so many early coastal sites are known only indirectly, through tools found inland, through changes in settlement patterns, through stories that outlast physical remains. The submerged landscape is real, it is extensive, and it is quiet. It does not announce what it once was. It does not point upward toward the present. It simply remains where it is. When later cultures speak of lands lost beneath the sea, they may be responding to this quiet persistence. The knowledge that something existed beyond what can now be reached, that the ground itself has moved on. As we consider these submerged spaces, there is no need to imagine cities resting intact beneath the waves. What matters is more subtle. Large areas of land were once available. They were used. They were left behind as conditions changed. The ocean did not take them suddenly. It absorbed them slowly, and in doing so, it created a separation between what can be walked and what can only be remembered. This separation shapes how loss is understood. A place on land can be revisited. A place underwater becomes distant in a different way. As we continue, this quiet distance will remain important, not as mystery, but as context. The world beneath the water is not empty. It is layered, shaped by time, and carrying traces that are no longer meant to be seen. When something slips beneath the surface of the sea, it does not remain as it was. The ocean is not a container. It is a system in motion. Water moves constantly, even when it appears still. Currents travel along the surface and along the bottom. Tides rise and fall with steady rhythm. Storms reach down and disturb layers far below. Anything placed within this movement begins to change. Salt water is especially active. It accelerates chemical reactions that weaken stone and metal. Minerals dissolve slowly, surfaces roughen, edges soften. Over time, materials that once held clear shapes begin to lose definition. Lines blur, corners round. What was once clearly built starts to resemble what formed naturally. Marine organisms add another layer to this process. Barnacles, algae, corals, and bacteria attach themselves to exposed surfaces. They do not distinguish between rock and structure. They simply grow. As they grow, they add weight. They trap sediment. They create texture where smoothness once existed. Sediment itself is always moving. Rivers carry fine particles into the sea. Waves stir sand along the bottom. Currents deposit silt in slow, even layers. Over decades and centuries, these layers accumulate. What rests on the seafloor becomes partially buried, then more deeply covered. Eventually, it may disappear entirely beneath compacted sediment. From above, there is no indication that anything lies beneath. The surface smooths, the record quiets. This is one reason underwater evidence is difficult to interpret. Preservation underwater is uneven and selective. Some materials last longer than others. Most do not last long at all. Wood decays quickly in oxygen-rich water. Plant fibers dissolve. Leather and textiles vanish. Bone weakens as minerals leach away. Stone endures longer, but even stone is not immune. Limestone dissolves slowly in salt water. Granite fractures under repeated stress. Even the hardest materials yield to time and movement. Light also plays a role in erasure. Sunlight fades rapidly with depth. Colors disappear first. Red vanishes, then orange, then yellow. Without light, visual clarity declines. Details that might reveal human origin become harder to see. Recognition requires proximity. Proximity requires access. Most submerged areas are difficult to reach. They require specialized equipment. Time underwater is limited. Visibility is often poor. This means that even when something remains, it may not be noticed, or it may be misidentified. Natural formations can resemble structures. Structures can resemble natural formations. The ocean does not label what it contains. It does not preserve context. It does not keep records. From a scientific perspective, this is not neglect. It is function. The ocean exists to circulate heat, nutrients, and energy. Its role is movement. Anything within it becomes part of that circulation. This explains why absence of evidence underwater is common. not because nothing was there, but because conditions favor transformation over preservation. For the human mind, this absence can feel like silence, a lack of confirmation, a gap where something should be. But silence in geology does not mean emptiness. It means time has continued without pause. Many ancient coastal sites are known only through indirect signs, tools found inland that suggest earlier shorelines, changes in settlement locations over time, patterns of abandonment followed by relocation. The physical places themselves may be gone, or altered beyond recognition, but the movement remains traceable. This helps explain why stories persist even when evidence fades. Memory fills where material dissolves. Narrative survives where structure cannot. When later generations speak of lands lost beneath the sea, they are not necessarily pointing to intact ruins. They may be responding to an inherited understanding that something once existed where water now lies. The ocean does not deny this. It simply does not confirm it. Its role is not to remember. Its role is to move. And movement over long spans of time leaves very little behind that can be easily read. As we continue, this pattern will remain important, not as frustration, but as explanation. The sea does not guard secrets, it dissolves them. What remains is not absence. It is change carried so far forward that its origin becomes quiet. And quiet, in the language of time, is not nothing. It is simply the sound of processes continuing without interruption. By this point, it becomes easier to loosen the grip on the idea of Atlantis as a single place, a fixed point, a location waiting patiently to be identified. Another way of understanding Atlantis is quieter and broader. Atlantis can be seen as a pattern rather than a place. Across cultures and centuries, myths often form this way. They do not preserve one event with precision. They gather many similar experiences into a single story. They merge, they condense. Anthropological research shows that cultural memory rarely catalogues events individually. It groups them by meaning. Losses that feel similar are remembered together. Changes that share emotional weight are folded into one narrative. In this process, specificity gives way to coherence. A flood in one region, a collapsing shoreline in another, a volcanic island breaking apart elsewhere. Each experience is distinct, but the feeling is familiar. People leave, land changes, a way of life ends. Over time, these experiences no longer stand alone. They are remembered through one another. The boundaries blur. This is how a single name can come to represent many losses. Atlantis does not need to describe one city. It can describe the experience of cities lost to water, not in one moment, but across many. Cultural memory works by overlap. When similar stories are told repeatedly, they reinforce one another. What remains is not a timeline. It is a shape that feels recognizable even when details differ. This explains why descriptions of Atlantis feel both specific and elusive. There are canals, harbors, order, structure, yet no location fully matches, because the story is not meant to. It is an aggregation, a composite. Myths often operate as containers. They hold many moments, that cannot be easily separated. They provide a shared reference point for experiences that occurred in different places and times. In this sense, Atlantis becomes a shared memory rather than a preserved site. This does not make it imaginary. It makes it collective. Collective memory does not aim for accuracy. It aims for continuity. It preserves the fact that something happened often enough to matter, often enough to be remembered, often enough to require a name. The human mind responds strongly to pattern. When similar events repeat, they begin to feel connected. Even if they were separated by centuries, a name helps organize that repetition. It gives shape to recurrence. Atlantis functions this way. It gathers stories of environmental change, of societies altered by water, of permanence giving way. The power of the story comes from this accumulation, not from a single origin. If Atlantis were only one place, its loss would be finite. It would belong to a moment. It would end. As a pattern, it remains relevant because the conditions that shaped it continue. Coastlines still shift. Seas still rise. Land still subsides. Human settlements remain vulnerable to these processes, not because they are careless, but because they exist at the edge. By framing Atlantis as a pattern, the story softens. It no longer demands proof. It no longer asks to be found. It asks to be recognized. Recognition does not require agreement on details. It requires familiarity. People recognize Atlantis because they recognize change. They recognize displacement. They recognize the feeling of something stable becoming unstable. This is why the story persists across time and culture. Not because it refers to a specific coordinate, but because it refers to a recurring condition. The name becomes a shorthand, a way to speak about loss without cataloging every instance. In this framing, searching for Atlantis as a single place becomes less important. What matters is understanding why so many places contributed to the story. The ocean did not take one city. It took many edges, slowly, sometimes suddenly. Memory gathered those edges together. Atlantis is what remains when geography becomes difficult to separate, when losses overlap, when stories converge. It is not a map, it is a summary. And summaries are not meant to be exact. They are meant to endure. As we continue, this perspective allows the story to settle. It no longer presses outward in search of confirmation. It rests inward as recognition. Atlantis does not need to be placed. It has already been experienced, not once, but many times, in many forms, across long stretches of time. And because it is a pattern rather than a place, it remains available, quietly, without urgency. A name that holds many memories. A story that does not belong to one shoreline, but to all the moments when land and water renegotiated their boundary. This is where Atlantis rests most comfortably, not beneath the sea, but within the shared shape of human remembering. Change does not always arrive slowly. Sometimes the ground itself shifts in a single moment, quietly, without warning. Along the edges of continents, the earth is rarely still. Beneath soil and stone, massive plates press against one another. They move at speeds too slow to feel, until they don't. Earthquakes are the result of this pressure releasing. Energy builds over long periods of time, then lets go. Not as intention, but as physics. When earthquakes occur near coastlines, their effects can reach beyond the land. The ground may rise, or it may sink. In some cases, it does both in different places at once. This vertical movement is called subsidence when land drops downward. Even a shift of 1 or 2 meters can permanently alter a shoreline. What was once above water may suddenly fall below the reach of the tide. These changes do not require destruction to be significant. Buildings do not need to collapse. Waves do not need to surge. The land simply settles lower than before. Geological records show that coastal subsidence has happened many times throughout history. Entire stretches of shoreline have dropped abruptly in a single event, or over a short series of events. For people living in these regions, the experience would have been disorienting. A harbor suddenly deeper than expected, a familiar beach gone, freshwater sources contaminated by salt. In some cases, earthquakes trigger tsunamis. But even without waves, the change in elevation alone can reshape a coast. Land that sinks does not return easily. The sea adjusts instantly. Archaeologists studying ancient coastal settlements have identified sites that appear to have been abandoned suddenly, not gradually relocated, but left behind. This pattern often aligns with evidence of seismic activity. Walls remain unfinished. Tools are left where they were used. There is little sign of long-term decline. From the outside, this can resemble catastrophe. From the inside, it may have felt like displacement. A realization that the ground itself could no longer be trusted. The human mind responds strongly to sudden environmental change. Events without warning create lasting impressions. They are remembered differently than slow transitions. A coastline that moves slowly may fade from memory. A coastline that drops overnight becomes a story. In regions with frequent seismic activity, oral traditions often include references to ground movement and water intrusion. Not always as earthquakes, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as consequence. These stories are not geological reports. They are memory shaped for survival. Scientific understanding shows that earthquakes are not rare anomalies. They are a regular expression of how the planet releases stress. Most go unnoticed. Some reshape landscapes. Coastal areas are especially sensitive because they sit at the meeting point of land and water. A small change in elevation can shift that balance dramatically. Dry ground becomes tidal. Tidal ground becomes submerged. Over time, repeated seismic events can permanently alter a coastline, not in a single dramatic motion, but through accumulation. A harbor deepens, a delta collapses, an island fractures. This kind of change does not leave obvious ruins. It leaves misalignment, landforms that no longer match expectation. For later generations, the cause may be unclear. All that remains is the outcome. A place that once existed and now does not. The human mind seeks explanation when cause is hidden. It fills gaps with narrative, not to deceive, but to connect. When a city or settlement is lost suddenly, memory preserves the moment more vividly. The loss feels intentional, even when it is not. This is how stories of sudden disappearance take shape, not as inventions, but as reflections of abrupt change. Earthquakes remind us that stability is conditional. The land beneath our feet feels solid until it shifts. As we continue, this contrast will remain important. Between slow change and sudden movement, between gradual forgetting and sharp remembrance. Some stories linger because they unfold slowly. Others persist because they arrived all at once. The earth allows for both. Quiet movement over centuries, and brief moments that redraw everything. Neither requires meaning. Both leave memory behind, and memory, shaped by the mind, does what it can. It holds on to what moved too fast to fully understand, and lets the rest settle, layer by layer, into the background of time. Not all islands remain islands. Some exist only for a time, formed by heat and pressure, and then altered by the same forces that created them. Volcanic islands rise from the seafloor through repeated eruptions. Lava accumulates, rock cools, land slowly builds upward until it breaks the surface. For long periods, these islands can feel stable. Soil forms, plants grow, people settle near the water's edge. But volcanic islands carry a different kind of impermanence. They are built around emptying spaces, magma chambers beneath the surface that do not remain full forever. When a large eruption releases enough material, the ground above can no longer support itself. The land collapses inward. This collapse forms what geologists call a caldera. Caldera collapse does not always look dramatic from a distance. It can occur quickly, or in stages, but its effects are lasting. Large sections of land can drop suddenly. Seawater rushes in to fill the space. What was once continuous land becomes fragmented or disappears entirely. One of the most studied examples of this process occurred in the Aegean Sea. The volcanic island now known as Santorini experienced a massive eruption in the 2nd millennium BCE. Before the eruption, the island was more complete. Afterward, it was broken into a ring shape surrounding a flooded center. Geological evidence confirms that the eruption expelled enormous amounts of material. Ash layers from this event are found across the eastern Mediterranean. The collapse reshaped the island's geography permanently. For people living nearby at the time, the experience would have been disorienting. Familiar landforms changed, harbors altered, coastlines no longer matched memory. Even without direct destruction, such changes would have required relocation. Trade routes would shift, settlements would move. What once felt central might suddenly feel distant. Volcanic collapse does not require a mythic interpretation to feel profound. It removes land quickly, and land removed quickly is remembered differently. Unlike slow sea level rise, collapse creates a clear before and after. A memory anchored to an event, not a process. This distinction matters for how stories form. Gradual change often becomes background. Sudden change becomes narrative. In regions shaped by volcanic activity, oral traditions frequently include references to islands sinking, breaking, or being consumed by the sea. These stories do not preserve technical detail. They preserve sequence. Land was here. Then it was altered. Scientific study shows that volcanic islands around the world have experienced similar collapses. Some have lost large portions of their surface area. Others have disappeared almost entirely beneath the water. The remains are not always obvious. Submerged calderas can resemble natural basins. Collapsed slopes blend into the seafloor. Time smooths the edges. For later observers, only fragments remain. A partial island, a submerged ring, a coastline that curves inward without explanation. The human mind does not always distinguish between collapse and submergence. What matters is the outcome. Land no longer accessible. A place no longer whole. This is why volcanic collapse often appears in stories of lost lands. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is memorable. It compresses change into a single moment. It provides a clear transition. It leaves little opportunity for gradual adjustment. People do not slowly adapt to collapse. They respond to it. In time, the scientific details fade. The event becomes simplified. The memory remains. An island that broke. A land that fell inward. Water taking the place where ground once stood. These descriptions are not precise, but they are consistent. They reflect how the mind stores sudden change. As contrast, as interruption. Volcanic islands remind us that land itself can be temporary, not because it erodes slowly, but because it can fail all at once. As we continue, this pattern will remain important. Some losses happen quietly, others arrive fully formed in memory. Both shape how stories of disappearance endure, not as exact records, but as impressions carried forward. The Earth does not choose which changes will be remembered. It simply changes. What the human mind does with those changes determines which ones become stories. Human settlements have always gathered near water, not by accident, but by necessity. Water offers food. It offers transportation. It offers connection. Rivers create fertile soil. Coastlines allow movement beyond what land alone permits. Early trade depended on boats long before it depended on roads. Because of this, some of the earliest known civilizations formed along the edges of water. They clustered near deltas, bays, and sheltered shores. Places where land and sea met gently enough to support daily life. Living near water shaped how these societies developed. Fishing supplemented agriculture. Trade routes extended outward. Ideas traveled with goods. But proximity to water also introduced vulnerability. The same forces that made these locations desirable made them unstable. Flooding was not rare. Storm surges reshaped coastlines. Riverbanks overflowed seasonally. For people living in these environments, adaptation was constant. Homes were rebuilt. Fields were relocated. Boundaries shifted. Archaeological evidence shows repeated patterns of coastal occupation and abandonment. Settlements appear in layers, one built atop another, each responding to slightly different environmental conditions. Some sites were not rebuilt at all. When water encroached too far, relocation became the only option. People moved inland or along the coast, leaving behind what no longer fit. This movement was rarely framed as loss at the time. It was adjustment, survival. But memory transforms adjustment into narrative. A place once central becomes peripheral, then distant, then remembered. The human mind tends to associate importance with origin, Places where life began feel foundational. When those places change or disappear, the feeling lingers. This is especially true for coastal communities. The shoreline often defines identity. It determines work. It shapes rhythm. When the shoreline moves, identity must shift with it. Over time, the reasons for movement may fade. Environmental pressures are replaced by simpler explanations. The water came, the land was taken. Archaeologists often find evidence of coastal life farther inland than expected. Fishing tools, marine shells, trade goods far from the modern shore. These findings suggest coastlines once lay elsewhere. That water once met land in places now far from the sea. To the people who lived there, this change was gradual. To later observers, it appears abrupt. The context collapses. The outcome remains. This is how disappearance takes shape in story. Not as a process, but as a moment. Coastal civilizations were not fragile. They were adaptable. They survived because they could move. But adaptability does not erase memory. It reshapes it. A city relocated is still remembered as a city lost. A harbor abandoned is remembered as swallowed. What once anchored daily life becomes a reference point in memory. The human mind does not catalogue history like a ledger. It organizes experience around meaning, around what changed things. For coastal societies, water was both giver and taker. It sustained life. It also forced movement. This dual role makes water a powerful element in cultural memory. It becomes associated with transition, with endings, with beginnings elsewhere. Over generations, the specifics fade. The why becomes less clear. The where becomes more symbolic. A place by the water becomes simply a place that is no longer there. This pattern repeats across regions and time periods. Different cultures, different coastlines, similar stories, not because they shared a single event, but because they shared a condition. Living close to water meant living with change, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden. When later generations look back, the movement of entire communities can feel inexplicable. Why would people leave such a useful place? Why would they abandon access to water? The answer is usually simple. The water moved first. As we continue, this relationship between civilization and shoreline will remain central, not as tragedy, but as context. Early societies did not vanish, they shifted. What remained behind was not destruction. It was absence. And absence, when remembered, often becomes something else. Something named. Something condensed. A lost place. A drowned city. A shoreline that no longer exists. The world keeps adjusting its edges. And people adjust with it, leaving behind stories shaped by where they once lived and where they could no longer stay. When physical places disappear, something else often remains. Not stone, not walls, but story. Human beings have always carried memory forward through words. Long before writing, before maps, before measurement. Stories moved where people moved. Oral traditions are not casual inventions. They are structured systems of remembrance. Anthropological research shows that spoken narratives can preserve core information for thousands of years. especially when that information is tied to survival. Details shift over time, names change, timelines compress, but the central shape of an event often endures. Something happened, it mattered, and it was remembered. When stone erodes or sinks, memory does not require permanence. It requires repetition. Stories told often enough become familiar. Familiar stories feel true, not because they are precise, but because they are shared. This is how stories outlast places, not by accuracy, but by continuity. A settlement that disappears beneath rising water leaves few physical traces, but the experience of leaving it does not vanish. It travels with the people who relocate. It settles into language, into explanation. Why are we here? Why did we leave? Why does the shoreline feel wrong? Answers become simplified so they can be carried. The water came, the land was lost. Over time, these explanations detach from specific geography. They become portable. A story that can be told anywhere. Cognitive science shows that the human mind prioritizes narrative coherence over factual completeness. Memory organizes itself around meaning, not measurement. This means that stories often preserve the emotional truth of an event rather than its physical mechanics. Fear, displacement, loss, adaptation. These elements remain recognizable even when details blur. When multiple generations repeat a story, its edges smooth. Contradictions are removed. Unnecessary specifics fall away. What remains is a core image, a place that was once there, and then was not. This image is powerful because it explains change without requiring technical understanding. It does not ask listeners to imagine sea level curves or tectonic movement. It asks them to imagine leaving. Archaeologists often encounter this gap. Material evidence disappears, but cultural memory persists. In some regions, stories describe villages that sank. In others, cities taken by water. In still others, islands that broke apart. These stories are not carbon copies. They differ in detail and tone, but they share structure. Something stable became unstable. Something familiar became unreachable. People adapted, and they remembered. This repetition across cultures does not require a single shared event. It reflects a shared human experience. Living close to change, the ocean does not preserve memory, but people do. When land disappears beneath water, it creates a clean absence. No ruins to walk through, no foundations to point at. This absence invites story, not to deceive, but to orient. A story fills the space where certainty once lived. It gives shape to loss. It makes displacement intelligible. The human mind does not tolerate meaninglessness for long. When explanation is missing, narrative steps in. This does not mean stories are false. It means they are functional. They carry lessons. They carry warnings. They carry acknowledgement. They say this has happened before, and it may happen again. In this way, stories become a form of continuity, not of place, but of experience. A shoreline may move, a city may vanish, but the understanding that land can be lost remains available. This is why stories of drowned places feel calm rather than frantic. They are not news. They are inheritance. They have already passed through the urgency of the moment. What remains is recognition, and knowing that the world is not fixed, that permanence is conditional, that change does not require intention. As we continue, this distinction will matter between what is remembered physically and what is remembered culturally. Atlantis, whatever its origin, lives in this space, not as stone, but as story. It survives not because it can be found, but because it continues to be told. And stories, once they settle into the mind, do not need proof to persist. They need only repetition and time, both of which the world provides generously. As stories travel through time, they rarely stay the same size. They expand. They simplify. They gather weight. This is not a flaw in memory. It is a feature. The human mind is not designed to preserve exact detail across generations. It is designed to preserve meaning. What mattered? What changed things? What should not be forgotten? When a story is told once, it reflects a moment. When it is told many times, it reflects a pattern. Cognitive science shows that each act of remembering subtly alters what is remembered. Recall is not retrieval. It is reconstruction. The mind rebuilds the past each time it is accessed. Details that feel unnecessary are gradually dropped. Details that carry emotional weight are reinforced. Over time, the story becomes smoother, easier to hold, easier to pass on. This process naturally increases scale. A small settlement becomes a city. A severe flood becomes a great flood. A difficult relocation becomes a sudden loss. Not because anyone is exaggerating, but because scale helps memory travel. Large images are easier to remember than small ones. Clear contrasts last longer than subtle gradients. A land that slowly changed becomes a land that vanished. Anthropologists studying oral traditions have observed this pattern repeatedly. As stories move further from their origin, they gain symbolic clarity. They lose specificity. They gain resonance. A story that survives hundreds of years is rarely cluttered with detail. It is shaped around a few strong images: water rising, land breaking, people leaving. These images are not technical descriptions. They are anchors. They allow listeners to recognize the story even if they have never seen the place, even if they live far from water, even if the original geography no longer exists. This is how myths grow larger. Not in content, but in reach. A myth is not a lie. It is a story that has been shaped for endurance. When a story must be remembered without writing, without records, without physical evidence, it must become portable. It must fit inside the mind. It must survive distraction and distance. This requires simplification, not distortion, but compression. Over generations, the causes of change become less important than the outcome. Why the water rose matters less than the fact that it did. How long it took matters less than the result. The human mind is especially sensitive to endings. Beginnings and endings are remembered more clearly than middles. Gradual transitions fade. Conclusions remain. This is why myths often describe sudden events, even when the underlying processes were slow. A city is destroyed in a night. An island sinks all at once. The middle is removed. The story becomes easier to tell and easier to remember. This does not mean the story is dishonest. It means it has been adapted to the constraints of memory. In many cultures, repeated retelling also increases moral or symbolic meaning. A lost place becomes a lesson, warning, an example. The story begins to carry more than history. It carries interpretation. This layering is gradual. Each generation adds a small adjustment, a slight emphasis, a clearer contrast. Over time, the story becomes larger than any single event that inspired it. It becomes a container for many experiences, multiple floods, multiple relocations, multiple disappearances, all gathered under one name. This is how a place can come to represent more than itself. It becomes a symbol of impermanence, of overreach, of change, not because it was intended to, but because it was useful. The human mind does not preserve stories that serve no function. Stories persist because they do something. They explain, they warn, they reassure. A story about a land lost to water reassures listeners that change is survivable. Others lived through it. Others adapted. At the same time, it warns that stability is temporary, that power does not prevent loss, that geography is not fixed. As myths grow larger, they become less about what happened once and more about what always happens. This is why the scale of Atlantis feels immense, why it is described as powerful, advanced, complete. The size of the story matches the size of the idea it carries. It is not only about a place, it is about the fragility of places. As we continue, this expansion will remain important, not as embellishment, but as transformation. The story does not grow to deceive, it grows to endure. What began as experience becomes narrative. What was local becomes universal. And in that process, the myth becomes large enough to hold the attention of the mind, large enough to survive time, large enough to remain familiar even when its origin has faded. This is not inflation. It is adaptation. A story that stayed small would be forgotten. A story that grew became lasting. And so it continues, not because it is accurate in every detail, but because it fits the way memory works, quietly, persistently, growing just enough to remain. At this point, the question can finally be allowed to surface, not urgently, not sharply, but calmly. Could something like Atlantis have existed? Not the image that often comes to mind, not a perfectly preserved city waiting beneath the waves, but a real place, or places, that inspired the story that came to carry that name. From a scientific perspective, this question does not require belief or disbelief. It requires conditions. For a society to inspire a story like Atlantis, several things would need to be true. None of them are extraordinary on their own. Together, they form a familiar pattern. First, people would need to live near water. History shows this was common. Early societies favored coastlines, bays, and river mouths. Water supported food, trade, and movement. Second, the land they lived on would need to change, slowly or suddenly, through rising seas, earthquakes, or volcanic collapse. Science confirms all of these processes occurred repeatedly in the ancient world. Third, the loss would need to matter, not just physically, but culturally. A small, temporary camp would not linger in memory. A place of coordination, trade, or identity would. Archaeology increasingly shows that early societies were more complex than once assumed. Large settlements existed earlier than expected. Trade networks extended farther than previously believed. Coastal sites, however, are underrepresented in the physical record. This absence is not evidence of non-existence. It reflects preservation bias. What survives best is what remained on land. The conditions required for a place like Atlantis are not rare. They are common. What is rare is evidence that remains accessible. When later generations look back, the lack of material proof can feel decisive. But science treats absence differently. Absence narrows conclusions. It does not close them. This distinction matters. The name Atlantis does not need to refer to a single location. It may never have. It can represent a category, a remembered loss rather than a map point. Many myths function this way. They compress multiple events into one narrative, multiple places into one place, multiple memories into one name. In this framing, Atlantis becomes a container, not for fantasy, but for accumulated experience. From a geological perspective, nothing prevents advanced coastal societies from having existed and later being altered or submerged. What prevents confirmation is access, time, and the nature of water. The ocean is not cooperative with history. It covers rather than preserves. It reshapes rather than displays. This means that scientific caution is necessary, not skepticism. Caution. Science does not ask whether Atlantis was real in the way stories are real. It asks whether the processes described are plausible. Rising seas are plausible. Sudden subsidence is plausible. Volcanic collapse is plausible. Human relocation is plausible. Memory distortion over generations is not only plausible, it is expected. When all of these elements are present, stories emerge naturally, not as inventions, but as interpretations. The human mind does not require perfect continuity to remember. It requires significance. A place that disappeared quietly would fade. A place that altered the course of lives would remain. This is where Atlantis sits most comfortably, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a question shaped by real conditions. Could it have happened? Yes. In many forms, in many places, over long spans of time. Was there a single definitive Atlantis? Science cannot say, and does not need to. What matters is that the story aligns with how the world behaves. Land shifts. Water rises. People move, memory adapts. Atlantis survives not because it defies science, but because it fits within it. The name endures because it names something familiar. Loss without clear edges. Change without witnesses. A past that cannot be walked. As we move forward, the focus will continue to soften. The question does not need to be answered. It only needs to be held. Atlantis does not ask for certainty. It does not demand discovery. It remains where it has always been, at the intersection of geology and memory, of land and water, of what once was and what is quietly remembered. And in that space, it does not disturb rest. It allows it. The idea of finding a single, definitive location for Atlantis carries a quiet appeal, a point on a map, a place to circle, a depth to measure. But the world beneath the water does not organize itself that way. Most of the ocean floor remains only partially understood. Even today, large portions of the seafloor have never been mapped in high detail. What exists instead are broad outlines, contours without texture, shapes without resolution. Ocean mapping relies heavily on remote sensing. Satellites measure subtle changes in sea surface height. Sonar scans trace the depth below. Together, they produce images that are accurate at large scales and indistinct at small ones. This means that the finer details of submerged landscapes remain difficult to see. Individual structures, shallow features, irregular formations, they blur into the background. Deep-sea archaeology faces similar limits. Human exploration underwater is constrained by depth, pressure, time, and visibility. Most archaeological work takes place in relatively shallow water, close to shore, within reach of light and air. Beyond those limits, access becomes rare. Equipment grows complex, time becomes short, visibility narrows. Even when sites are suspected, confirming them is slow and uncertain. Water filters light quickly. Sediment obscures surfaces. Currents shift material over time. What is visible one year may be buried the next. Many submerged areas are also inaccessible for practical reasons. Strong currents, cold temperatures, extreme depths. These are not barriers that invite persistence. They're conditions that encourage acceptance. From a research perspective, this means the underwater past is unevenly known. Some areas are studied repeatedly. Others are barely touched. The result is not ignorance. It is partial knowledge. This partiality matters when considering Atlantis. The expectation of a single preserved site assumes stability. It assumes a landscape that waited patiently to be rediscovered. But the ocean does not wait. It moves, it covers, it rearranges. Even if a place once existed that inspired the story, its remains would not necessarily appear intact. They would likely be fragmented, scattered, altered beyond recognition. Search efforts often begin with grids, systematic sweeps, careful passes over selected areas, but grids dissolve quickly. Underwater, boundaries blur. The seafloor does not respect straight lines. What seems like a promising feature from a distance may dissolve into irregular rock up close. What appears natural may contain traces of human activity that are difficult to distinguish. The difference between structure and geology is not always obvious beneath the sea. This ambiguity does not frustrate science. It defines its limits. Scientific inquiry does not require complete answers. It works within uncertainty. It adjusts expectations based on conditions. In the case of Atlantis, those conditions are restrictive by nature. Time has passed. Water has moved. Land has shifted. The expectation of a single location also assumes that the story refers to a single event, a single place, a single disappearance. But earlier sections have shown how stories form, how memories compress, how names gather multiple experiences into one. If Atlantis is the result of layered memories, then no single site would satisfy the story. Each candidate would feel incomplete. Each location would answer only part of the question. This does not weaken the story. It explains its persistence. The human mind often seeks clarity through location, a place to stand, a point to orient from. But some stories are not meant to resolve spatially. They exist to describe conditions rather than coordinates. In this sense, not finding Atlantis is not failure. It is alignment. Alignment with how the ocean behaves, with how evidence is preserved, with how memory operates across time. Scientific limitations do not invalidate possibility. They define scope. Ocean mapping will improve. Technology will advance. Some areas will become clearer. But even with better tools, the expectation of a single, definitive discovery may remain unmet. Not because nothing existed, but because what existed did not remain whole. This is a normal outcome when dealing with deep time and deep water. It reflects the nature of the medium, not the absence of history. As this understanding settles, uncertainty becomes less troubling. It becomes neutral. The story does not require confirmation to function. It does not depend on recovery. It continues because it describes a world that behaves exactly as observed. Change without record. Loss without boundary. Memory without map. As we move forward, this limitation will remain present, not as an obstacle, but as context. The ocean keeps much of its past diffuse, spread thin, unevenly available. What remains accessible is not a place, but an understanding that some questions do not narrow as time passes. They widen. And within that widening, the story of Atlantis does not disappear. It simply becomes quieter, less pointed, more patient. A story not waiting to be found, but allowed to remain where it is, between what can be known and what can be held without certainty. When viewed across long spans of time, water is not the only force that behaves like an ocean. Time does as well. Time moves without surface, without markers that can be felt in the moment. It carries change forward quietly. Geological time does not align with human memory. The scales are different. Processes that take thousands of years register as gradual, but when remembered, they feel sudden. This is a known effect in how the human mind understands the past. Slow change is difficult to perceive as it unfolds. Only in retrospect does it appear dramatic. A shoreline that moved a few meters each generation feels stable to those living within it. Only later does the accumulated distance become clear. Geologists describe the Earth's surface as layered, not only physically, but temporally. Sediment settles in thin layers. Each layer represents a period of time, quiet, incremental. No single grain announces itself. Together, they form thickness. Human experience does not register each grain. It registers the layer when it becomes visible. This is why gradual environmental change is often remembered as a turning point. The turning point is not when the change began. It is when it became undeniable. The human mind prefers events to processes. Events are easier to store. Processes require patience. Time encourages compression. Long sequences are shortened. Extended shifts become moments. From this perspective, Atlantis does not feel like something that took centuries. It feels like something that happened. This does not mean the memory is wrong. It means it has been shaped by scale. Geological time dwarfs individual lives. No single person experiences a coastline moving its full distance. Each person experiences only a small adjustment. Memory bridges these experiences by collapsing them into a single narrative. When scientists reconstruct the past, they rely on traces, layers of sediment, chemical signatures, shifts in fossil distribution. These records show slow, continuous change, not abrupt disappearance. But when these changes are translated into human terms, they feel sudden. A map is redrawn. A boundary shifts. What took thousands of years to occur can be described in a sentence. This translation is necessary. It allows understanding, but it also alters perception. The human mind is sensitive to outcomes, not durations. This is why time itself becomes a kind of ocean. It carries details away. It smooths edges. It erodes specificity. What remains is the broad shape of what occurred. In this sense, time behaves like water. It does not destroy instantly. It transforms gradually. Both time and water leave behind traces that are difficult to interpret without context. A smooth stone, a buried shoreline, a memory without a date. The story of Atlantis exists at this intersection, where long processes meet short recollection, where gradual change feels abrupt. Time does not preserve beginnings and endings equally. Beginnings are often lost. Endings are emphasized. A place slowly becoming uninhabitable is remembered as a place lost. The middle fades. This is not a failure of memory. It is an adaptation. Memory must fit within the scale of human experience. It must compress to be useful. Time allows this compression by distancing the present from the process. What is far enough away becomes simplified. This simplification does not remove truth. It removes excess. What remains is the essence of change. As time deepens, stories settle. They lose detail. They gain calm. Urgency fades. Curiosity softens. What once demanded explanation becomes accepted as part of the past. In this way, time creates space for rest. Questions remain, but they no longer require resolution. The human mind adjusts to this distance. It learns to hold uncertainty without tension. Atlantis fits here naturally, not as an unresolved problem, but as a distant outcome of processes too slow to witness fully. Time has already done its work on the story. Edges have been rounded. Details have been smoothed. What remains is not confusion. It is quiet. As we continue, this quiet will deepen. The scale will expand. The need to know will ease. Time will continue to move forward, as it always has. And memory will continue to reshape what it carries. Not to erase, but to make what remains livable. In that sense, time is not an enemy of understanding. It is a filter. An Atlantis filtered through time becomes something that does not rush. It waits. It drifts, like sediment settling, like water smoothing stone, like a story that has already been told enough times to no longer need urgency. Time does not demand attention, it allows it to soften. And within that softness, the story rests. Civilizations often imagine themselves as fixed, rooted, built to last. But history suggests something quieter. Human societies tend to form along edges, and edges, by nature, do not stay still. Many early civilizations developed beside water, rivers, seas, deltas. These places offered resources, movement, and connection. They also required constant adjustment. Environmental shifts have shaped human history repeatedly. Changes in rainfall alter agriculture. Changes in temperature reshape migration. Changes in sea level redraw coastlines. Anthropological research shows that societies rarely collapse all at once. They relocate, they reorganize, they adapt to new boundaries. What looks like disappearance from a distance is often transition up close. Civilizations behave much like shorelines. They appear stable. They develop patterns. They accumulate structure. And then, gradually or suddenly, conditions change. A harbor silts up. A river shifts course. Saltwater reaches farmland. Trade routes move. None of these changes destroy a society immediately. They introduce pressure. Pressure encourages movement. People follow resources. They adjust to new limits. They build again where conditions allow. Over time, the original site becomes less central, then peripheral, then remembered. Archaeological records reflect this pattern. Settlements appear and reappear in different locations, often within the same region, sometimes only a short distance apart. This movement is not failure, it is continuity. Yet memory tends to frame it differently. What is left behind feels lost. What remains active feels current. The human mind prefers narratives with clear boundaries, a beginning, a middle, an end. But civilizations rarely provide that shape. They ebb and flow. They thin and thicken. They change form without announcing it. Environmental shifts rarely align with political ones. A city may remain culturally important long after its physical center has moved. A population may identify with a place that no longer exists in the same way. This creates layered memory. A city remembered not as it was at the end, but as it was at its height. In this way, civilizations become temporal shorelines. They mark where people once gathered, not where they remain permanently. Permanence is rare in human systems, not because of fragility, but because environments continue to change. The earth does not pause for structures or for plans. It adjusts constantly. Human societies adjust in response. This adjustment often goes unnoticed by those living within it. Each generation experiences only a portion of the shift. Only later does the full arc become visible. From the outside, it may appear that a civilization vanished. From within, it felt like adaptation. The difference between these perspectives shapes story. When a society relocates gradually, memory compresses that movement. A series of decisions becomes a single moment. A slow shift becomes a sudden loss. This compression does not mislead intentionally. It reflects scale. Anthropological studies show that cultural continuity often persists even when physical locations change. Language, ritual, social structure. What moves is place, what remains is identity. This distinction matters when considering stories of lost civilizations. What is remembered as disappearance may be relocation. What is remembered as collapse may be transformation. The human mind holds on to the image of what was most recognizable, not the process that followed. Civilizations near water are especially subject to this pattern, because water changes edges, and edges define boundaries. As coastlines move, so do centers of life. Ports relocate, trade shifts, homes follow. Over centuries, these adjustments accumulate. The original site may no longer be inhabited, or it may lie underwater, or it may exist only as a name. This does not mean the civilization ended. It means it moved. Atlantis does not need to represent a sudden annihilation. It can represent a shoreline moment, a point where conditions changed enough to require movement. Civilizations are not monuments. They are processes. They emerge. They adapt. They disperse. They leave traces where they once stood, and memories where those traces become inaccessible. As we continue, this understanding allows the story to soften further. Loss becomes transition. Disappearance becomes relocation. The focus shifts away from endings toward continuity. Civilizations do not vanish easily. They flow, like shorelines, like water, like time itself. And when memory looks back, it often sees the edge, not the movement that followed. That edge becomes a story, a place, a name, not because it was final, but because it marked a change that could not be ignored. In this way, civilizations are temporary shorelines, stable enough to matter, flexible enough to move. They leave behind stories not of failure, but of adjustment. And those stories persist, quietly, long after the water has settled into its new shape. As depth increases, the ocean changes its behavior, not dramatically, but decisively. Sound moves differently underwater than it does through air. It travels farther, but it also bends. It scatters. It loses direction. Low-frequency sounds can pass across great distances beneath the surface. High-frequency sounds fade quickly. Edges blur. Sources become difficult to locate. This is one reason the ocean feels quiet, even when it is active. Movement does not announce itself clearly. It diffuses. Light behaves the same way. Sunlight weakens rapidly with depth. Within the first few meters, brightness diminishes. Colors disappear in sequence. Red fades first, then orange, then yellow. By the time depth increases further, the world becomes blue and gray. Below that, light vanishes almost entirely. Vision yields to shadow. Detail softens. This loss of light creates a sensory boundary. Beyond it, recognition becomes difficult. Shapes lose context. Distance becomes hard to judge. Pressure increases steadily as depth increases. Every meter adds weight. This pressure compresses space. It dampens movement. It stills disturbance. The deeper the water, the quieter the environment becomes. Not because nothing happens, but because the conditions suppress signal. The ocean does not echo the way open air does. Sound is absorbed, motion is slowed, energy is dispersed. From a scientific perspective, silence underwater is not absence. It is attenuation. Processes continue constantly beneath the surface. Currents flow, sediment drifts, organisms move and feed. But these processes do not create sharp markers. They do not leave clear traces that persist. This has implications for how the past is preserved. Events that occur underwater leave fewer audible and visible signatures. Change happens quietly, without broadcast. A collapse beneath the sea does not roar. A submerged shoreline does not announce itself. Once below the surface, transformation proceeds without witness. The human mind is sensitive to this kind of quiet. It associates silence with finality, with closure, with disappearance. But in the ocean, silence does not mean ending. It means continuation under different conditions. This distinction matters. Many environments preserve history through interruption. Fire leaves ash, ice leaves layers. Dry land leaves ruins. The ocean preserves through smoothing, through coverage, through reduction. It does not mark moments clearly. It blends them. Sound, light, and pressure work together to create this effect. They reduce contrast. They soften boundaries. They make change less noticeable. This is why underwater sites are difficult to interpret even when they are found. Context is missing. Orientation is unclear. Time feels compressed. A structure encountered underwater appears timeless. It is difficult to know when it was altered or how long it remained exposed. This ambiguity is not frustrating to science. It is expected. The ocean is not a medium designed for record keeping. It is a medium designed for balance, heat exchange, chemical circulation, biological movement. These functions require quiet efficiency, not preservation. When later generations imagine the ocean holding secrets, they are responding to this quiet, the sense that something could be there without making itself known. But scientifically, the ocean does not keep secrets. It removes contrast. What remains becomes harder to distinguish from its surroundings. The human mind often interprets this as intentional silence, as concealment, as withholding. But there is no intention in attenuation. There is only physics. Sound spreads until it fades. Light weakens until it disappears. Pressure increases until movement slows. Together, these conditions create an environment where history does not announce itself. This helps explain why stories of lost places beneath the sea feel hushed. They are not told loudly. They are not urgent. They are remembered as something that slipped away quietly, without witnesses, without noise. The ocean encourages this tone. It absorbs disruption. It smooths edges. It settles. As depth increases, even storms above lose their influence. Surface chaos fades. Below, the water remains calm. This vertical separation creates a sense of detachment. What happens above does not fully reach below. What happens below does not rise easily to the surface. In this way, the ocean creates distance not only in space, but in experience. The human mind responds by softening its expectations. Certainty becomes less important. Resolution feels unnecessary. Silence allows questions to remain open without tension. As we move closer to the end of this story, the ocean's silence becomes instructive, not as mystery, but as permission. Permission for things to remain diffuse. Permission for absence to be neutral. Permission for memory to exist without proof. The ocean does not rush to explain itself. It does not clarify. It does not summarize. It continues. And in that continuation, silence is not emptiness. It is equilibrium. A steady state where movement persists without announcement, where change occurs without disturbance, where history is carried forward without insisting on recognition. This is why the ocean feels like a place where stories can rest, not because it hides them, but because it does not amplify them. The silence is not a barrier. It is a condition, one that allows the human mind to settle, to release the need to hear everything, to accept that some things remain quiet, and in that quiet, the story no longer asks to be solved. It simply remains, held by pressure, dimmed by depth, smoothed by time, not erased, not concealed, just allowed to be silent. There comes a point where remembering no longer depends on evidence, where meaning separates itself from verification and continues on its own. The human mind does not require certainty to hold something. It requires relevance, a sense that what is remembered still matters. Cognitive science shows that meaning and accuracy are stored differently. Facts depend on reinforcement and confirmation. Meaning depends on resonance. A story can lose its details and still remain intact. Because what it carries is not data, it is understanding. Cultural stories persist not because they are proven, but because they are useful. They explain, they orient, they connect. This is especially true for stories about loss. Loss does not always leave evidence behind, but it leaves impressions. When a place disappears, proof may vanish with it. Stone erodes, wood dissolves, boundaries shift. But the experience of leaving remains available to memory. And that experience is what stories protect. Anthropologists note that many enduring cultural narratives are not anchored to verification. They survive because they encode shared experience. Displacement, adaptation, change. These narratives do not ask to be confirmed. They ask to be recognized. The human mind is comfortable with this arrangement. It holds many things without needing resolution. Childhood memories without photographs, emotions without explanation, moments without timestamps. Stories of lost places function in the same way. They are not hypotheses. They are acknowledgements. They say something happened, something important enough to remember, even if the specifics are no longer available. Modern thinking often treats proof as a requirement for meaning. But this is a recent habit. For most of human history, continuity mattered more than confirmation. A story repeated across generations did not need to be tested. Its survival was its validation. This does not mean people believed blindly. It means belief was not the goal. Orientation was. Stories help people situate themselves in a changing world. They explained why landscapes felt unstable, why old paths no longer worked, why movement was sometimes necessary. In this way, meaning does not require certainty. It requires usefulness. The human mind can hold ambiguity without distress when the story provides coherence, when it fits what is observed, when it aligns with experience. Atlantis functions here, not as a claim demanding proof, but as a story that mirrors real patterns. Coastlines change, settlements move, memory compresses. These truths do not depend on discovering ruins. They are observable without confirmation. Curiosity can exist without resolution. It can remain open, gentle. There is no urgency in not knowing, no deficit in uncertainty. In fact, uncertainty often allows stories to remain alive longer. A resolved story ends. An open one continues. This continuation is not agitation. It is steadiness. The human mind does not seek answers endlessly. It seeks balance. When a story offers balance, it can rest without conclusion. Stories that insist on proof create tension. They ask to be settled. They provoke debate. Stories that offer meaning without demand create calm. They allow listeners to place themselves within a larger pattern, without pressure. This is why some stories feel appropriate for rest. They do not pull attention forward. They do not insist on outcome. They linger softly. Remembering without proof does not mean ignoring reality. It means recognizing that reality includes memory, experience, interpretation. Not everything meaningful leaves a trace that can be measured. Some things leave traces in behavior, in language, in repetition. These traces are no less real for being intangible. The human mind is well adapted to carrying such things. It does so constantly, without effort. A story about a lost place does not need coordinates to exist. It needs continuity, a reason to be told again. As long as people recognize something of themselves within it, the story remains relevant. As long as it aligns with lived experience, it persists. Atlantis does not require proof to function. It functions because it speaks to change without demanding certainty. In this way, the story becomes restful. It does not push outward. It settles inward. The need to resolve fades. The need to explain softens. What remains is not a question to be answered, but a recognition to be held. Meaning does not dissolve in the absence of proof. It adapts, and when it adapts well, it no longer disturbs. It accompanies quietly, without urgency, without demand. This is the space where remembering becomes gentle, where stories no longer ask to be confirmed, only to be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, they remain calm, open, available. Not as puzzles, but as companions. Stories that can be carried without weight, without argument, without the need to know more than is already felt. Here the story rests and allows the mind to rest with it. There are some questions that do not ask to be answered. They ask to be kept. Atlantis has become one of these, not a problem to solve, but a quiet question that has learned how to remain. Across generations, the name has persisted without resolution, and yet it has not faded. This persistence suggests something important. Questions can survive without conclusions. They can exist as stable structures in the human mind, held gently, without pressure. Uncertainty is not always a temporary state. many cases, it becomes the resting place. Scientific inquiry often moves toward answers, but it also recognizes limits, boundaries where data cannot reach, conditions where confirmation is unlikely. In these spaces, uncertainty does not weaken understanding, it completes it. The idea of Atlantis does not collapse under uncertainty. It is shaped by it. The story does not grow sharper with time. It grows softer. Edges blur. Certainty loosens. What remains is an outline rather than a figure. This outline is enough. The human mind does not need full resolution to settle. It needs coherence. A sense that what is held makes sense within the world as it is observed. Atlantis fits within what is known about land and water, about memory and time, about how stories form. Because of this, the question no longer agitates. It does not demand discovery. It does not insist on proof. It rests as possibility. Possibility is a gentle state. It allows curiosity without urgency, interest without tension. This is why Atlantis can remain present without becoming intrusive. It does not disrupt rest. It accompanies it. The question of Atlantis behaves differently than unresolved problems. It does not narrow. It widens. Each generation encounters it from a different position, with different knowledge, different tools, different assumptions, and yet the question remains recognizable. This stability within uncertainty is not accidental. It reflects how some ideas are designed to function. They are not meant to end. They are meant to persist. In cultural memory, certain questions act as anchors. They provide continuity across change, a shared reference point. Atlantis functions this way. It marks an intersection between what was once experienced and what can no longer be confirmed. The human mind is capable of holding such intersections. It does so without strain when the story aligns with observed reality. Coastlines change. Civilizations move. Memory compresses. These patterns continue. The question remains relevant because the conditions remain present. Exploration does not require resolution. Curiosity does not require closure. There is value in allowing a question to remain open. It invites reflection rather than argument, observation rather than insistence. This openness is not confusion. It is acceptance. The ocean does not resolve its own history. It carries it forward in altered form. Covered, diffused. Time does the same. Atlantis becomes part of this broader pattern, a question carried forward without needing to be answered. It remains because it does not strain the mind. It does not demand belief or disbelief. It allows the listener to sit with possibility, to recognize change without needing to label it completely. This is why the question of Atlantis feels appropriate in a quiet setting. It does not activate urgency. It does not sharpen attention. It softens it. The horizon is a useful image here, a line without an edge, a boundary that cannot be reached. It is always present, always distant, always the same. Atlantis functions like that horizon. It does not move closer with effort. It does not retreat when ignored. It simply remains. The human mind learns to accept this presence, not as an incomplete task, but as a companion thought. As this acceptance settles, the question dissolves into background awareness. It no longer needs to be articulated. It becomes part of the quiet structure of understanding. A recognition that some stories are not destinations. They are orientations. They point rather than conclude. As we approach the end, this quiet question does not seek to follow us. It stays where it is, resting, no longer asking, no longer waiting, just present. A shape at the edge of thought, stable, unresolved, and completely at ease. In that ease, the story no longer needs to move. It has arrived where it belongs, in stillness, not solved, not dismissed, simply held. The story no longer needs to be carried forward. It can be set down, not because it is finished, but because it has reached a place where movement is no longer required. At the surface, water is always shifting. Ripples respond to wind, waves answer distant storms. But given enough time, even disturbed water settles. The motion smooths itself, energy disperses, edges soften. This is how stories end when they are allowed to drift, not with conclusion, but with stillness. Atlantis does not need a final image. No ruins revealed, no coordinates confirmed, no explanation secured. It simply eases into the background, where stories that are complete enough tend to rest. The human mind recognizes this moment, the point at which curiosity no longer pulls forward. When attention loosens its grip, nothing is unresolved here. There is no tension waiting to be released, only quiet continuity. The story has already done what it needed to do. It traced patterns. It followed water. It noticed change without resisting it. Now it recedes, not disappearing, just becoming less distinct. Like a shoreline at dusk, where land and sea blend until the boundary is no longer clear. This blending is not loss, it is integration. What was once separate becomes part of a wider field. The story no longer stands apart from the world it describes. It becomes another gentle feature within it. The ocean does not mark endings. It absorbs motion. It allows energy to spread thin enough that nothing calls attention to itself. Stories behave the same way when they are complete. They do not announce their departure. They simply stop pressing. The human mind responds by softening, by letting go of the need to hold the story in focus. Thoughts begin to move differently, slower, less defined. There is no instruction here, no direction to follow. Only the natural settling that occurs when stimulation fades. Questions no longer require framing. They lose their edges. They drift alongside other impressions. Time resumes its quiet passage. Not measured, not observed, just present. Atlantis no longer stands as a question. It no longer stands as a story. It becomes part of the ambient understanding that some things are carried for a while and then released. The human mind is practiced at this. It does it each night, with images, with thoughts, with the day itself. The ocean smooths after movement. The surface regains its calm. Depth holds steady. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be remembered actively. What remains is not absence. It is rest. a quiet state where stories do not need to justify themselves, where meaning does not require attention. This is where the story belongs now, not held, not pursued, simply present enough to fade. As awareness drifts, the distinction between story and silence narrows. Words lose their shape, ideas lose their urgency. The mind does not need to follow them. It can remain still, or move gently, or not move at all. The story has already settled. The water has already smoothed. There is nothing left to search for, nothing left to resolve. Only the quiet continuation of rest, uninterrupted, unclaimed. Atlantis does not end here. It does not need to. It dissolves into the same place where all calm stories go. Not concluded, just quiet. And in that quiet, nothing asks to be remembered. Nothing asks to be known. The night holds what remains, without effort, without expectation. The water stays still. The story drifts no further. Everything has arrived where it needs to be.